In this video, I'm going to look at the first 20 lines of A Midsummer Night's Dream. If you're studying iGCSE English literature, you might get a question like this. How does Shakespeare present the relationship between Theseus and Hippolyta at this point in the play? A how question will always expect you to look very closely at language and its effects, but I'm also going to give you a bit of context here, as it's useful when trying to understand the relationship between this couple and also for our wider understanding of the play. Firstly, if we look at the stage directions, we learn that the play starts in Athens, Greece, and in a palace. Athens at this time was a well-established city with a clearly defined social hierarchy, and Theseus is at the top of it. He and Aegeus, who we meet shortly after this excerpt, are noblemen. Theseus has a palace. He's a duke and in a position of wealth and power. Note that the most ordered and structured elements of the play are set in Athens, whereas when the younger characters move into the forest or the dream world, there is much more chaos and misrule. Not only is Theseus a powerful man, he's a man in a man's world. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare paints a picture of patriarchal society where daughters are supposed to do what their fathers ask of them before they become subservient to their husbands. This would have been a perfectly normal assumption for an Elizabethan audience, although Elizabeth I, of course, did not marry and relinquish her power. But the interaction between Theseus and Hippolyta is a bit more uncomfortable for a modern audience, as we have different ideas about the treatment of women. Remember that this play was probably first performed in the year 1598, and interestingly, Shakespeare was writing it about the same time as he wrote Romeo and Juliet. Remember this when you look at the interaction between Hermia and her father, which is similar to the conflict between Lord Capulet and Juliet. Both men want to choose their daughter's suitor. In the exchange between Theseus and Hippolyta, we see them discussing their impending marriage. Marrying for love is a relatively modern concept. In Shakespeare's time, people stuck to their class, and therefore aristocracy married aristocracy, i.e. rich and powerful families united through marriage and became even more powerful. Remember, Theseus is a duke and Hippolyta is a queen. The names Theseus and Hippolyta may sound familiar to you. Shakespeare has taken these names from Greek myth. Remember Theseus killing the Minotaur. Hippolyta is the Amazon queen of Greek legend, daughter of Ares, the god of war. You may have heard of the play Hippolytus by Euripides, an ancient Greek tragedy. In it, Hippolytus is the illegitimate son conceived after Theseus abducts Hippolyta, and Hippolytus is eventually murdered by his own father. So although Shakespeare puts his own spin on his Theseus and Hippolyta, their names undoubtedly have connotations of violence. Nevertheless, it's important to note that this is a comedy, not a tragedy, and that we don't see any violence between Hippolyta and Theseus in the play. Actually, Theseus is quite kindly towards the younger lovers later in the play and tries to temper Aegeus's fury at his daughter's lack of obedience. You'll notice that this part of the play is written in blank verse. We can quickly detect this because the start of each line is capitalized and the meter is iambic pentameter, but the verse does not rhyme. In Shakespeare, it's often the noble or aristocratic characters who have these sorts of lines. Later, when you look at the mechanicals, notice the rhyme and meter that they use is quite different. Language is very revealing about class and hierarchy. Just like now, these characters are judged on the way that they speak. When Theseus refers to their nuptial hour, he's talking about their imminent wedding, which he cannot wait for. There are several positive adjectives in his opening lines, such as fair, meaning beautiful, and happy. He's very keen to be married, and presumably to consummate the marriage too, so his role could be played in rather a lustful, or at least eager manner. There are many devices that convey a sense of longing, such as the assonance in Theseus's speech. When we start to look closely at the language in this play, we realize that what initially seems to be a funny, sweet play about love is also about sex and power. Theseus refers to the moon as a marker of time and complains that it wanes slowly. He cannot wait to get hold of Hippolyta. Look at the excitement in the use of the exclamatory. How slow this old moon wanes. He compares the moon, always female in literature, to a stepdame or a dowager who spends a long time withering out a young man's revenue. This means that the moon is as frustrating as an old and rich woman who refuses to die and pass on her inheritance, but keeps on spending it and making the younger generation wait for what's left. This image conveys a sense of frustration on Theseus's part, but it's also humorous and establishes the tone of the play as a comedy. Now let's look at Hippolyta's lines. Hippolyta's response is less frantic and much more composed. Although very polite, she seems less eager to marry, and she uses the adverb quickly twice to show that for her time is whizzing by, and that they will soon, perhaps too soon, be married. Both characters refer to the moon or the pale companion repeatedly. Indeed, it's a symbol that crops up many times in the play. So what is the significance of the moon? Whilst a reference to the moon often occurs simply just to show that the play is taking place at night, it is after all a Midsummer Night's Dream, and the mechanicals in particular use it this way. It also has connotations of romance, and it's clear that Theseus is trying to woo Hippolyta. We also associate the moon with beauty and magic, and of course much of this play is going to involve the magic of the fairy kingdom. For the Elizabethans, it might also bring to mind the idea of the sublunary world. So, the Elizabethans thought that the area or atmosphere between the Earth and the Moon, the sublunary world, was touched by Adam and Eve's sin and fall from grace, whereas the atmosphere above the Moon and beyond, the heavens, was still a heavenly and pure place full of divine love. There are some other key words that I'd like to zoom in on. When Hippolyta describes the shape of the moon, she uses a simile comparing it to a bow, as in a bow and arrow. She is the queen of the Amazons, and these women were archers, which reminds us that these lovers, Hippolyta and Theseus, have been warring lovers. Later on, you'll meet the king and queen of the fairies, Oberon and Titania, and they are also fighting. Both relationships indicate that marriage is not easy, and the course of true love never did run smooth. In Shakespeare's day, the actors that played Hippolyta and Theseus would also play Titania and Oberon, so the parallels between the two characters would have been even more obvious, as they were played by the same people. Back to Theseus. Note that Theseus's eagerness to be married and his status and power is evident in his use of the imperative here, as he gives commands to Philostrate to stir, awake, turn. Let's zoom in again on the semantic field of war. I've mentioned the reference to the archer's bow, and I'd like to focus on Theseus's claims that he wooed Hippolyta with my sword and won thy love doing the injuries. This might set your alarm bells ringing, as it clearly implies a violent conquest of the Amazon queen, suggesting that she's the spoils of war. The sword can often be interpreted as a phallic symbol in literature. If you know Romeo and Juliet, it's used a lot in crude comic banter between the lads of the play. It's likely a symbol of male power and violence in this speech, although Theseus determines to now transform that conquest into official love and change the tone of the relationship. I will wed thee in another key. The use of the modal auxiliary I will suggests his determination to transform the relationship from something violent into something respectable and celebratory. And the use of repetition at the end of his speech adds emphasis to this wish. This idea of relationships starting through antagonism but ending in harmony is something that will apply to the play as a whole. Many of the relationships are fractious when we first see them. Hermia and her father are fighting. Oberon and Titania quarrel over the changeling boy. Helena adores Demetrius, but he doesn't want her at the start of the play. There's a lot of confusion and chaos and comedy along the way, but ultimately the play ends on a harmonious note and normality is restored. So the journey from war to peace, acknowledged by Theseus in this part of the play, is significant as it's mirrored in the relationships of many other characters. Thank you very much for listening, and do take a moment to give this video a thumbs up.